made you wanted to get into this study about fashions? Because it seems like everybody is into our fashions. And now, is it our fashions? Can we really call it that?
Well, actually, if we look at it historically and do the research, we find that much of what we know today as fashion actually comes from African people. I got into it in traveling with my husband, Ashraf Kwesi, and also Dr. Josephine Yakinen in the Nile Valley. And they tell you to go back and research so you can resurrect your ancestors. And so when I came back, that's what I decided to do. And since I was already involved in the fashion area, I decided to look there.
Okay, what sort of stuff are we seeing today that started back in I guess, ancient Egypt, and that's now being worn today, and been, I guess, appropriated by Europeans?
Okay, when we look at it historically, and my presentation that I do deals with it from a historical basis, it's also visually documented. And what I do is detail the symbols, the styles, the practices that have been copied, desecrated, and manipulated throughout the years. But like I said, most of them come from African people, because fashion is an area in which we see visual imagery through symbolism. And Europeans have taken these images and used them to increase their self-esteem while decreasing ours. But many brothers and sisters today may not realize that what we actually know today as fashion comes from African people, although it's in a European distorted mindset form as we see it. And many brothers may think that in dealing with fashion that we're dealing with something lightweight, something only for the sisters. But when we look at African fashion, it's a way of communicating, and it indicates social status, cultural group, age, religion, economic status, and even power. In fact, as many brothers and sisters are getting dressed for work this morning, the styles and practices that they use today actually came out of ancient Egypt. For example, many brothers are now shaving. The razors, the tweezers came out of ancient Egypt. Many sisters are taking those curlers out of their hair right now. Hair curlers came out of ancient Egypt and date back over 3,000 years ago. There also, many of them are putting on makeup, using cosmetics. That too was developed in ancient Egypt over 4,000 years ago. And what we find today is also the application practices that they use in terms of the makeup also too came out of Africa. In terms of the makeup, as I was saying, the sisters will, that dates back from ancient times, and the application techniques that we use date back to ancient times too. But in Europe, in the 16th and 17th century, cosmetics were used to cover up the scars that they had from diseases. And when those cosmetics didn't work, they ended up having to use masks. And so we find that we were the forerunners in terms of fashion. We set the standard. So long before Vogue and long before glamour, you know, we set the standards for beauty.
So what you're saying is that basically the stuff that the women are wearing today, and I'm getting into the cosmetic stuff, I guess the eyeliners and the blush and the lipstick and that kind of stuff, we were using that under different
Right, right. Used coal around the eyes to shield the eyes from the inundation of the from the rays of the sun during the inundation of the Nile. And that became an everyday practice because sisters began to realize that this eye makeup made them look really good. And so it became an everyday practice. Another thing, and I call this the most revolutionary step that you can make every day, the underpants came from us. And many brothers and sisters, as they're getting ready, they're stepping into their underpants right now. And that, too, goes back to ancient Egypt because I have a terracotta figure from Edfu in Egypt dating back over 3,000 years ago showing the underpants. But in Europe, most Europeans did not even wear underpants until the 18th century. So while we were wearing them over 3,000 years ago, they didn't even wear them 300 years ago.
Well, why are African garments so popular now amongst the Europeans?
Because they're looking at it as a fad. And what Europeans do, they look into the areas in which they can make money. And we have become an international commodity. They take a look at what we're doing, what we're wearing, then they copy it, and they wear it too.
You go to Japan, and they all try to get that funky hip-hop look that started here as well.
Right.
Is that an extension of what's going on all over Europe?
Yes, and in fact, I have some information from the Chicago Sun-Times. Everybody's getting into the act on this. And the Chicago Apparel Center has opened what they call an Afrique boutique, and they gearing the merchandise to what they call the $282 billion group. And they say that it's not a politically correct move on retailers' part, it's big business. Recent census figures show that non-whites make up 1/4 of the U.S. population, and that number is expected to grow. And with everyone from Spiegel's black targeted E-style catalog to McCall's patterns jumping on the Afrocentric bandwagon, stores have discovered that only one color matters, and that's green.
All right, 10 minutes after 5 o'clock, 1-800-286-KJLH. Number to call to speak to Maury Rod. This is a fascinating topic about fashions that I guess that another thing that I guess we started, and we really didn't know that we started it.
That's right.
And then we lost it, just so much like the pieces of our culture and music, and then other folks that they started it. They probably did, because we don't know.
Right. Well, see, the thing is that we see our fashion around us every day.
And sister, I want to ask a question,
Yes.
real quick, about the this issue of like the Kenta cloth. I was down at Sanko and Kmart, and I'm seeing a resurgence of all this Kenta cloth. Could you explain where the Kenta cloth came from and what it means?
Okay, much of what we see in the mass merchandiser department stores is not the real kente cloth. Now, the kente cloth is a woven type of fabric that results from using silk fibers on horizontal looms. That which we see in the mass merchandiser department stores is actually a printed cloth. And what has happened is that they're trying to jump on the bandwagon with this. But kente cloth, the real kente cloth, comes from Ghana. And there's a book called Introduction to Kente. I can't remember the author on that one. But they describe the process used in the creation of the kente. Now, at one time, that was woven for the royalty or the very rich, and the rejects were thrown out to the market. An elder in Kumasi, in this book that I'm talking about, mentioned that first the Europeans came in and they took the black men, women, and children. And then they came back in to come back for the natural resources, the tobacco, cocoa. And he said, and now they're coming in for the only thing that we have left, our kente. And they're trying to capitalize on it all.
He mentioned the kente cloth. We see a lot of people wearing that. Yeah, apparently they have no knowledge of what it is. It's just another fad, much like the dashiki was back in the 60s, much like you mentioned the X, wearing the X, and now it's gone. Do you think we'll stick with the kente cloth? You think some brothers, years ago pass it on, if they knew or understand what it's all about to their
Well, I think that's the whole process that we need to get involved in, is understanding what we're wearing. Because our ancestors did not wear certain garments because some white person told them that it was in season this year only to be thrown out the next, like the bell bottoms that we see our children wearing today. So what we have to do is take it upon ourselves to research, to learn more about our culture and our traditions. And one thing that I wanted to get into is with the Moors. Now, I talked about ancient Egypt, but the Moors were the ones who preserved the Egyptian cultural traditions, which Dr. George G.M. James tells us in A Stolen Legacy. And they brought such things to Europe as the silk and cotton industry. And also they introduced public baths. Now, they had to do this because there was a disease running rampant in Europe known as coprophilia, and that means love of filth. In fact, like in monasteries, they would only take maybe 4 baths a year. And in fact, it had to take a brother to come in and teach these people in Europe, and Spain in particular, how to wash their clothes between wearings, about taking baths, about using perfume and deodorant. And Dr. Ivan Van Sertima talks about him, and his name was Viriab, and he's in the book, The Golden Age of the Moors. But when the Moors were banished from Spain, the Spanish textile industry fell too. Now, in Europe, fashion reflected the environment that they were in and the thinking processes. And in a book that I have called Dirt, by a person by the name of Terence McLaughlin, who is a European who talks about his European ancestors, he mentions how fleas were so common in Europe. And he says fleas were so common that they were regarded almost affectionately as a constant companion to man. Certain fleas and lice, if not man's best friends, might be considered his closest friends. And those who were lucky enough to have the best and warmest clothes often had the most fleas. So you have to ask, well, what type of fashion could have come out of this environment? Well, Brother Carl, there's something that we wear today, and many people aspire to, that actually came out of this vermin, flea-ridden environment, and that was the fur coat. And let me just give you some information, some background information on the origins of the fur coat. And this comes from a book called A History of Costume by Rachel Kemper. A standard wardrobe item was the flea coat, a shaggy, lounging robe, often of wolfskin, whose purpose was to induce the fleas to leave the wearer and dive into the fur. By the 16th century, it had shrunk to a mere flea fur, the hide of a small animal elegantly mounted in gold and gems and carried in the hand or draped around the arm like a stole. So the fur coat was not originally designed for warmth or beauty. It was designed to keep the fleas off the body.
Wow. 1-800-286-KJLH, 20 minutes after 5 o'clock. Good morning.
And if we take a look at the historical background, once again, on these European fashion, we'll realize that a lot of it came about from a very distorted type of mindset. For example, in terms of the European male clothing, much of that is actually sexually oriented clothing, and it's designed to advertise the European male prowess. For example, they initially wore tights, and then what they do is put artificial calves in those tights because the male leg was a feature of sex attraction. Now, what else did they have as a feature of sex attraction? They would emphasize the penis by using cod pieces. They would wrap their penis with fabric and leather in order to have it to stick out. And in fact, in the Iceman Inheritance, Michael Bradley talks about that. And he says, in several periods of Western history, the penis has been emphasized by cod pieces. And I'm going to show you some examples of these cod pieces in my presentation. If you come out on Saturday, you can see them. In Elizabeth's England, cod pieces grew so large that men began the custom of tying ribbon around them at 1-inch intervals in order to advertise their prowess. Some cheated a bit on the interval, and Elizabeth was forced to pass laws guaranteeing the 1-inch measurement, a progressive bit of consumer protection for the female population. But not only the cod piece, but even the fly on the men's pants is actually to advertise their prowess. Initially, the fly was on the side, and it was later moved to the front to draw attention to that area. And in the 1830s, when the fly was moved, they called those fornication pants. And today, even the male suit, the suit is actually to advertise the European male prowess. Now, the European cut on the male suit, because of its tubular style, the rigid, its shape on it, also is to emphasize the penis. It's a replica of the penis. And the tie. Everybody knows where that long tie points. Once again, that's to emphasize the penis. Now, while the European men were so busy focusing on the penis, women's fashions were actually modeled after the shapes of African women. And there was a sister by the name of Saartjie Baartman. This is in the 1700s. And she was taken from Azania, South Africa. And she was put on display in Europe because she had the shape most admired by her countrymen. In other words, the sister was well endowed in the buttocks area. And so when the sister died, they went and put her buttocks on display in the Museum of Man in France. But that's where they got the bustles from, the bustles that we see in those European dresses, and also the corsets, because they were trying to use those in order to create shapes like African women. And Michael Bradley, again, in the Iceman Inheritance, he talks about those corsets and bustles, and he says that in order to wear those type of fashion, that was actually an act of aggression. We've been the fashion pace setters throughout the ages, and many designers now are looking to us in order to set their fashions. But what happens with these European designers when they try to copy the fashions or set certain fashions, they distort it, and it becomes something totally different. Now, in some ads you'll see for the African fashions, they'll call it exotic, erotic styles, or they even took the colors of our nationalistic flag, the red, black, and green, and these European designers are calling it a black party collection. So that which was once sacred to us, our flag, is now shown up as a black party in a desecrated format. They'll even call the clothing tribal clothing.
Straight up KJLH Compton, Los Angeles. That's Maria Rao discussing fashions, African fashions. 1-800-286-KJLH gets you on.